Okay, this is a quick overview of what we're going to be doing this week in the lab. I made some podcasts of what we're going to be doing, and now I figured maybe it'd be a good idea to talk about what we're going to be doing so you can understand how the podcast all fit in. The first thing we're going to be doing is configuring our router and switch for inter VLAN routing for VLAN 2 and VLAN 3. We're going to configure our router to get an IP address from the hack network via DHCP, and then we're going to configure two sub interfaces, one for VLAN 2 and one for VLAN 3. First thing we're going to do after we do that is configure the router as a DHCP server for VLAN 2. So we will do that following the instructions given in the lab in the podcast. Then we'll use our Windows PC to test getting an IP address from the router. The next thing we'll do is configure our router to be a DNS server. You can configure your router to provide some basic DNS services. So we'll do that. Modify our DHCP config so that our Windows machine is using our router as our DNS server, and do some testing on that. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to configure our Linux machine as a DHCP server, following the instructions given in the lab and in the podcast. Once we're done with that, we're going to move our Windows PC over to our other VLAN 3 port and make sure it can get an IP address from our Linux machine. Then we're going to set a DHCP reservation on our Linux machine. That's where a machine gets an IP address from DHCP, but it gets the same IP address every time. So we're going to put our Windows machine's MAC address in the config on the Linux DHCP server and make sure that that Windows machine gets that same IP address every time. Then we're going to do one other thing with DHCP. We're going to set up our Linux server to give out IP addresses for VLAN 2 as well as VLAN 3. And we're going to set up our router to listen for DHCP requests in VLAN 2 and then forward those over to the Linux server. So basically we'll set up our Linux server to have the config it needs. We'll move our Windows PC back to VLAN 2. We will turn off DHCP on our router, and we will set an IP helper address on this sub interface for the VLAN 2. And then any DHCP requests that our Windows machine sends, the router will receive and forward those to the Linux server. And the Linux server will provide the responses for VLAN 2 DHCP. And then finally, we're going to set up our Linux machine as a DNS server for our fake domain that we haven't made up yet. So we need to make up a fake domain name for that. And your Windows machine will ask your Linux machine some names, and the Linux machine will resolve those names for your domain and for other domains. So that's a quick overview of what will be going on in this week's lab. So now watch the other podcasts so you know what you're doing when you get to the lab.